In the spring of the year 40 after the birth of Christ, a woman named Livia Orestella stood in the imperial palace in Rome, her hands trembling, her face pale with terror, waiting to be brought before the emperor. Livia was 28 years old, the wife of Senator Gaius Calpurnius Piso, one of the wealthiest and most respected men in Rome. 3 days earlier, her husband had been arrested on charges of treason, charges that everyone in Rome knew were fabricated, based on nothing more than the fact that Piso had failed to laugh enthusiastically enough at one of the emperor's jokes during a public banquet. Livia had not been allowed to see her husband since his arrest. She did not know where he was being held or what was happening to him. She had been summoned to the palace by imperial guards who would not answer her questions, who had dragged her from her home despite her protests, who had brought her to this anteroom where she now waited, hearing sounds from beyond the door, laughter, the clink of wine cups, music, and beneath it all, sounds she could not identify but that filled her with a dread so profound that she felt she might vomit. The door opened. A guard beckoned her forward. Livia entered the great dining hall of the palace and saw a sight that would be seared into her memory for however many hours or days she had left to live. The Emperor Caligula reclined on a couch at the center of the room, surrounded by his closest companions and advisors, all of them drinking wine from golden cups. The remains of an elaborate feast covered the tables, roasted meats, exotic fruits, delicacies imported from across the empire. The guests were laughing and talking, the atmosphere festive, celebratory, and in the corner of the room, chained to a pillar, beaten so badly that his face was unrecognizable beneath the blood and swelling, was Livia's husband, Piso. He was naked. His body showed signs of torture, burns, cuts, bruises covering every visible surface. He was barely conscious, his head hanging forward, breathing in shallow, labored gasps. But what made Livia's blood freeze? What made her understand in that instant that something far worse than her husband's torture was about to happen was the way Caligula was looking at her. The emperor was 27 years old, handsome in the way that portraits depicted him, but his eyes held something that Livia had never seen in another human being. Not madness, exactly, not simple cruelty, but something colder and more terrible. A kind of playful curiosity, as if Livia were an insect that he was about to pull the wings off, and he wanted to see how long she would continue trying to fly. Caligula gestured for Livia to approach. She did, her legs barely able to carry her. When she stood before the emperor's couch, he smiled at her and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "Your husband is a traitor. He has plotted against me. The penalty for treason is death, as you know. But I am a merciful emperor, and I am willing to offer you a choice." Livia's voice shook as she asked what choice she could possibly have. Caligula's smile widened. "You can watch your husband die slowly over the next 3 days while we continue our feast, tortured in ways that will make what you see now seem gentle. Or you can take his place at my table tonight, as my guest, as my companion, and your husband will be executed quickly and cleanly tomorrow morning. The choice is yours." What happened to Livia Orestella in that dining hall over the next 6 hours would become one of the most whispered about events in Rome, spoken of in horrified tones by those who had witnessed it or heard about it from others who were there. What Caligula forced her to do, the humiliations she endured while her husband watched from his chains, the ways in which the emperor used her body and her suffering as entertainment for his guests. These details were recorded by historians who documented Caligula's reign, preserved as examples of the depths of cruelty that absolute power can produce. But before I tell you what happened to Livia Orestella, before I reveal the full horror of what Caligula did to her and her husband, I need to tell you about the emperor himself, about how a young man who had been beloved by the Roman people when he took power had transformed into a monster whose torture methods were so brutal, so inventive, so psychologically devastating that they shocked even the Romans, a people who regularly watched gladiators kill each other for entertainment and who thought nothing of crucifying slaves. This is the story of Caligula's most brutal torture methods, the story of how an emperor used pain and humiliation as instruments of power, how he turned torture into theater and suffering into spectacle, how he created a reign of terror so complete that senators would tremble at his approach and noblewomen would kill themselves rather than be summoned to the palace. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I am about to describe is documented in historical sources written by people who lived during or shortly after Caligula's reign, recorded by Roman historians who had access to eyewitness accounts and official records, preserved because the Romans themselves were horrified by what Caligula had done and wanted to ensure that history would remember him as a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power is given to someone who uses it without restraint or mercy. If you want to understand how tyranny actually functions, how torture becomes a language of power, how systematic cruelty can be used to control an entire society through terror, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to learn will change how you understand power, cruelty, and the depths to which human beings can sink when given authority over others with no limits and no accountability. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about how torture has been used throughout history as a tool of political control. Now let me tell you about Caligula, because to understand what happened to Livia Orestella and thousands of others during his reign, you need to understand the man who ordered these things. Caligula was born Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, in the year 12 after the birth of Christ, into the most powerful family in Rome. His great-grandfather was the Emperor Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire. His father was Germanicus, one of Rome's greatest generals and most beloved public figures. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, a woman known for her intelligence and strength of character. Caligula grew up in military camps on the German frontier where his father commanded the legions, and the soldiers gave him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, because as a small child he wore miniature military boots like the soldiers wore. Caligula's childhood was privileged but traumatic. His father Germanicus died when Caligula was 7, possibly poisoned by political enemies. His mother and 2 of his brothers were arrested on charges of treason and died in exile or in prison, victims of the paranoia of the Emperor Tiberius, who suspected everyone of plotting against him. Caligula survived by being careful, by making himself useful to Tiberius, by never showing any ambition or giving any cause for suspicion. He lived with Tiberius on the island of Capri for 6 years, watching the elderly emperor become increasingly paranoid and cruel, learning lessons about power that would shape his own reign. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Caligula was 24 years old and the only surviving male heir of the imperial family. The Roman Senate and people welcomed his accession to power with genuine joy. They remembered his father, Germanicus, with love. They hoped that this young emperor would restore the honor and dignity that had been lost under Tiberius's paranoid and cruel rule. The early months of Caligula's reign seemed to fulfill these hopes. He was generous, giving bonuses to soldiers and gifts to the people. He restored political rights that Tiberius had suppressed. He held magnificent games and spectacles. He seemed to be everything Rome had hoped for: young, energetic, generous, a worthy successor to Augustus. Then, in October of 37, just 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill. The nature of the illness is not clear from the historical sources, possibly encephalitis, possibly some other brain infection or fever. For several days he was near death. Rome held its breath, praying for the recovery of their beloved young emperor. He survived, but something fundamental had changed. The man who emerged from that illness was not the same person who had fallen sick. The Roman historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing decades after Caligula's death but drawing on contemporary sources and eyewitness accounts, describe the change in stark terms. Before the illness, Caligula had been, if not perfect, at least normal, ambitious, perhaps a bit vain, but functioning within the bounds of acceptable imperial behavior. After the illness, he became something else. He began to exhibit extreme cruelty, sadism, sexual perversion, and megalomania. He started to claim that he was a living god, equal to Jupiter himself. He began to torture and kill people, not out of any rational political calculation, but seemingly for his own amusement, to relieve boredom, to demonstrate his absolute power over life and death. Modern historians debate whether the illness caused brain damage that altered Caligula's personality, whether it triggered a latent mental illness, or whether the illness was simply a convenient turning point that allowed Caligula to stop pretending to be the person Rome wanted him to be and to reveal his true nature, shaped by a childhood watching his family destroyed, and by 6 years living with Tiberius on Capri, learning the darkest lessons about power. But whatever the cause, the change was dramatic and terrifying. Within months of his recovery, Caligula began implementing torture methods and public cruelties that went far beyond anything Rome had seen, even under Tiberius's worst excesses. And what made Caligula's torture methods particularly horrifying was not just their brutality, but their creativity, their psychological sophistication, their theatrical quality. Caligula did not torture people simply to extract information or to punish crimes. He tortured people as performance, as spectacle, as a way of demonstrating his absolute power and of entertaining himself and his circle. Torture became, in his hands, a kind of art form, a perverse art certainly, but one that showed a disturbing level of thought and planning. Let me tell you about the first principle of Caligula's approach to torture. The understanding that pain was most effective when it was public, when it was witnessed, when it became a story that would spread throughout Rome and make everyone understand exactly what the emperor was capable of doing to anyone who displeased him. Caligula turned torture and execution into theatrical performances. He would order prisoners executed not in the privacy of dungeons or in the quick, relatively merciful way that Roman law prescribed, but as public spectacles during banquets and celebrations, designed to shock and horrify witnesses while demonstrating the emperor's unlimited power over life and death. Let me tell you about one of Caligula's favorite methods, the feast execution. Suetonius records that Caligula would hold elaborate dinner parties for Rome's elite, senators, wealthy merchants, military commanders, foreign dignitaries in the great dining hall of the imperial palace. The guests would recline on couches around tables laden with the most expensive foods from across the empire. Musicians would play. Dancers would perform. Wine would flow freely. The atmosphere would be festive, convivial, the sort of party that Rome's elite had attended countless times. Then, in the middle of the meal, Caligula would signal to his guards. Prisoners would be brought into the dining hall, men accused of treason or conspiracy, or sometimes people who had simply offended Caligula in some minor way, or sometimes random people with no crime at all, except that Caligula wanted to demonstrate his power. And while the guests continued their meal, while the music played and the wine flowed, these prisoners would be tortured to death in the center of the room. The methods varied. Sometimes prisoners would be beaten to death with clubs, the sound of bones breaking mixing with the music and conversation. Sometimes they would be slowly strangled, Caligula timing it so that they would take 5 or 10 minutes to die, gasping and choking while the guests tried to continue eating. Sometimes they would be dismembered, limbs cut off one by one while they were still alive, screaming, bleeding to death slowly in the center of the room. Suetonius records that Caligula would watch these executions while eating, that he seemed to particularly enjoy timing bites of food to coincide with moments of extreme suffering, chewing a piece of meat while a prisoner's screams reached their peak, sipping wine while watching the light fade from someone's eyes. He would make jokes about what was happening, would comment on the prisoner's reactions, would rate different execution methods based on how entertaining he found them. The guests at these feasts were trapped in a horrifying situation. They could not leave without the emperor's permission, and leaving would suggest disapproval of his actions, which might make them the next victims. They could not show too much horror or sympathy for the prisoners, because that might suggest disloyalty to the emperor. But they also could not show too much enthusiasm, because being too enthusiastic about torture might make Caligula suspect them of being as cruel as he was, which he might interpret as a threat. So they had to sit there, reclining on their couches, forcing themselves to eat and drink and maintain neutral expressions while people were tortured to death a few feet away from them, all while knowing that at any moment Caligula might decide that one of them would be the next entertainment. These feast executions served multiple purposes in Caligula's system of control. They demonstrated his absolute power. He could kill anyone, at any time, for any reason or no reason, and no one could stop him. They terrorized Rome's elite, making them understand viscerally that their wealth and status meant nothing, that they were all just one imperial whim away from being the entertainment at the next feast. And they satisfied Caligula's own sadistic desires, his apparent enjoyment of watching people suffer while he ate and drank in luxury. But the feast executions were just one method among many. Let me tell you about another of Caligula's innovations, using wild animals not in the arena as traditional Roman spectacle, but in more personal, more intimate settings designed to maximize terror. The Roman games, the gladiatorial combats and beast hunts that took place in the Colosseum and other arenas were already brutal by any standard. Men fought to the death for the entertainment of crowds. Condemned criminals were sometimes thrown to wild animals as a form of execution, but these spectacles followed certain rules and traditions. They took place in public arenas. The condemned were given at least minimal chances to defend themselves. There was a ritual quality to it all, a sense that this was justice being performed, criminals being punished in a way that also entertained the people. Caligula took the basic concept, but stripped away all the ritual and tradition and public spectacle, making it personal and intimate and far more terrifying. He would have prisoners brought to small rooms in the palace or to his private dining areas. Wild animals, lions, bears, dogs, specially trained to attack and kill, would be released into these confined spaces with the prisoners. And Caligula would watch, often while eating dinner with guests, as the animals tore the prisoners apart. The confined space made it more horrifying. In an arena, a man might have room to run or dodge, or at least die relatively quickly. In a small room, there was nowhere to go. The prisoner would be trapped with the animal, trying desperately to find some corner or piece of furniture to hide behind while the beast hunted them. The death would be slow and agonizing, the prisoner mauled and bleeding but not killed immediately, their screams echoing off the walls while Caligula and his guests watched from behind bars or through windows. Cassius Dio records that Caligula called this playful cruelty, that he seemed to genuinely find it amusing, like a cat playing with a mouse before killing it. He would sometimes provide commentary on what was happening, critiquing the prisoner's attempts to evade the animal, rating different species of beast based on how entertaining he found their killing methods. "The lions are too efficient," he supposedly said once. "They kill too quickly. The dogs are better. They're more patient. They take their time." The psychological torture of these executions was as bad as the physical torture. The prisoner would be brought into the room and see the animal, would understand what was about to happen, would have minutes of pure terror before the beast was released, knowing exactly how they were going to die and being unable to do anything to prevent it. They would try to beg for mercy, would plead with Caligula to spare them, would promise anything if only they could avoid this fate. And Caligula would listen to the begging with apparent interest, sometimes even seeming to consider it, before signaling for the animal to be released anyway. Suetonius records a particularly horrifying detail, that Caligula would sometimes have prisoners fed to the animals limb by limb. This meant that the prisoner would be held down by guards while a beast, usually dogs or a bear, would be allowed to eat portions of their body while they were still alive. An arm might be offered first, the prisoner forced to watch as the animal gnawed through muscle and bone. Then perhaps a leg, then another limb. The prisoner kept alive and conscious as long as possible, experiencing the horror of watching their own body being consumed piece by piece, until finally blood loss or shock or direct attack on a vital area would bring death. This was not execution. This was sadistic torture designed to maximize suffering and terror, to create death so horrifying that the stories would spread throughout Rome and make everyone terrified of displeasing the emperor in any way. But Caligula's cruelty was not limited to common criminals or random victims. He specifically targeted Rome's elite, senators, nobles, wealthy families, using torture not just to punish but to humiliate, to demonstrate that no amount of wealth or status could protect anyone from his power, to crush the traditional aristocracy and make them understand that they existed only at his pleasure. Let me tell you about what Caligula did to senators who displeased him, because these cases reveal how torture was used as a political weapon to terrorize Rome's ruling class into absolute submission. Roman senators were supposed to be the most respected men in the empire, the cream of Roman society, men whose families had served Rome for generations, who owned vast estates and commanded enormous wealth, and whose opinions were supposed to matter in governing the empire. They were supposed to be treated with dignity and respect. There were traditions, customs, legal protections that were supposed to prevent them from being subjected to the kinds of punishments that were used on common criminals or slaves. Caligula systematically destroyed these protections, making senators understand that their status meant nothing, that they were as vulnerable as anyone else, that the emperor could do absolutely anything to them regardless of tradition or law. When a senator was accused of treason, and under Caligula, accusations of treason were easy to fabricate and impossible to defend against. The traditional process would have been a trial before the Senate or before imperial courts, with at least some pretense of due process. Caligula dispensed with such niceties. Senators would be arrested without trial, sometimes dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, sometimes seized while walking in the forum in broad daylight, and brought before the emperor for immediate judgment. And the judgments were foregone conclusions. Caligula would declare the senator guilty of treason, conspiracy, disrespect, or sometimes of nothing at all except failing to show sufficient worship of the emperor's divine status. Then the punishment would be pronounced and carried out immediately, often in front of other senators who had been summoned to watch. Suetonius records that Caligula would sometimes have senators stripped naked in front of their peers, a humiliation that was profound in Roman culture, where social status was closely tied to dignity and proper dress. The naked senator would then be beaten to death with rods by the emperor's guards, while the other senators watched. The beating would be deliberate and slow, designed to maximize pain and humiliation. The senator would be forced to their knees, then beaten methodically across the back, the legs, the arms, the head, bones breaking, blood flowing. The senators screaming and begging for mercy that never came, until finally they died from the accumulation of injuries, their body left in a broken heap on the floor. The other senators forced to watch would understand the message. This could be any of you, at any time, for any reason. Your status, your wealth, your family connections, the respect you've earned over decades of public service, none of it matters. You exist at the emperor's pleasure, and your death could be as humiliating and painful as this if you displease him in any way. But sometimes Caligula would do worse than simply killing the accused senator. Sometimes he would torture the senator's family members first, forcing the senator to watch, breaking them psychologically before killing them physically. Let me tell you about what happened to Senator Marcus Lepidus, one of Caligula's early favorites, who eventually fell from favor. Lepidus was accused of conspiracy, probably falsely, as most such accusations were. He was arrested along with his wife and his 2 young sons, boys aged perhaps 10 and 12. Lepidus was brought before Caligula and told that he would be executed for treason, but first he would have to watch what happened to his family. Lepidus's wife was brought out first. In front of her husband and her children, she was stripped and beaten by guards, then dragged away to be given to the soldiers as a plaything, a fate I'll return to later when discussing Caligula's use of sexual humiliation as torture. Lepidus was forced to watch, held by guards so he could not look away, could not even close his eyes. forced to witness his wife's humiliation and hear her screams as she was taken away. Then his sons were brought forward. Caligula had them tortured in front of their father, slowly and methodically. The details recorded by the historians are almost unbearable to read. The boys were beaten, burned, mutilated in ways designed to cause maximum pain without killing them quickly. They cried for their father to help them, begged him to make it stop, but Lepidus could do nothing except watch and listen to his children's suffering. This went on for hours. The boys died eventually from their injuries. Lepidus, by that point, had been broken completely, sobbing, no longer even trying to maintain any dignity, reduced to a shell of a person by watching his family destroyed in front of him. Then, finally, Caligula had him executed, but not quickly. Lepidus was taken away to be slowly dismembered, his death taking hours more, his mind likely gone by that point, unable to process any more horror after what he had witnessed. The story of what happened to Lepidus and his family spread throughout Rome. Other senators heard it and understood that Caligula was willing to target not just individuals but entire families, that resisting or displeasing the emperor might result not just in your own death, but in the torture of everyone you loved. This was a new level of terror, one that made traditional Roman values about protecting family honor meaningless, because there was no way to protect your family if the emperor decided to target them. Caligula also pioneered specific torture methods designed to have symbolic meaning, to send messages beyond just the infliction of pain. Let me tell you about one of the most horrifying, the removal of tongues before execution. When a senator or noble was convicted of treasonous speech, which could mean anything from actual conspiracy to simply failing to praise the emperor enthusiastically enough, Caligula would sometimes order that their tongue be cut out before they were executed. This was not done surgically or cleanly. The prisoner would be held down by guards. Their mouth would be forced open. Tongs would be used to pull out their tongue as far as it would extend. Then a knife would be used to cut through the tongue, sawing through the tough muscle and tissue, blood pouring from the victim's mouth, the victim choking and gagging and unable to scream because their tongue had been removed. The symbolism was clear. You spoke against the emperor, so you lose the ability to speak. You used your tongue to commit treason, so your tongue is taken from you. The punishment fit the crime in a perverse, literal way that Caligula seemed to think was clever. But worse than the symbolism was the suffering. Removing a tongue is agonizing and leaves the victim unable to communicate, unable to beg for mercy or even to scream properly. They would try to make sounds, but only gurgles and moans would come out, mixed with blood bubbling from their mouth. And they would remain alive for hours or even days after the tongue removal, suffering from infection and pain, unable to eat or drink properly, choking on their own blood until they finally died from the accumulated trauma. Cassius Dio records that Caligula would sometimes have these tongueless victims displayed in public places, standing in chains in the Forum or other central locations, so that Romans could see what happened to people who spoke against the emperor. The victims would stand there, blood drying on their faces and chests, trying to breathe through mouths that no longer worked properly, living warnings of what happened to those who forgot that speech was a privilege granted by the emperor and could be revoked at any moment. Similarly, Caligula would sometimes order the hands of accused conspirators cut off before execution, particularly if they were accused of writing treasonous documents. The hands would be removed at the wrists, one at a time, with the victim conscious. Again, the symbolism was clear. You used your hands to write treason, so your hands are taken away. And again, the suffering was immense. Blood loss, shock, pain beyond description, the victim forced to look at the stumps where their hands had been, knowing they would soon die, but having to endure hours of agony first. These mutilations before execution served no practical purpose. They did not extract information or prevent future crimes. They existed purely to create suffering, to satisfy Caligula's sadistic desires, and to generate stories that would spread throughout Rome and terrorize the population into obedience. Now let me tell you about perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Caligula's torture methods: his systematic use of sexual humiliation as a weapon. His understanding that violating someone sexually could break them more completely than any amount of physical pain. Caligula understood something profound about human psychology, that many people, especially in honor-based cultures like Rome, would prefer death to sexual humiliation. A Roman man could endure physical torture with a certain amount of stoicism, maintaining his dignity even in death. A Roman woman could face execution with courage if she believed her honor remained intact. But sexual violation destroyed honor in ways that physical torture did not, created a kind of shame that was considered worse than death. Caligula weaponized this understanding, using forced sexual acts as punishment for political enemies and as a way of humiliating their entire families. When a man was accused of treason or of displeasing the emperor, Caligula would often target the man's wife or daughters before killing the man himself. The women would be summoned to the palace, usually under some pretext, and then forced into the emperor's bedchamber. What happened there was not just rape in the conventional sense, though that was bad enough, but elaborate, deliberate sexual humiliation designed to maximize shame and horror. The historians record that Caligula would sometimes force husbands to watch as their wives were violated, the men held by guards and forced to keep their eyes open, unable to look away, unable to help, forced to witness their wives' humiliation while knowing that any attempt to intervene would result in even worse treatment. The wives would cry out for their husbands to help them, and the husbands could do nothing except watch, their own helplessness and failure to protect their wives, destroying them psychologically more effectively than any physical torture could. After the violation, the women would be sent back to their families, but the shame of what had happened would follow them forever. In Roman culture, a woman who had been sexually violated, even if forced, even if she bore no responsibility, was considered damaged, less worthy, a source of shame to her family. The violation of a senator's wife or daughter was thus not just an attack on the woman herself, but on the honor of the entire family, on the man's status as a Roman of dignity and worth. Caligula also used forced sexual acts as direct torture of male prisoners. Roman men were expected to be sexually dominant, never submissive. The idea of being forced into a sexually passive role was considered the ultimate humiliation for a Roman man, worse than death in many ways. Suetonius records that Caligula would sometimes order condemned men to be subjected to sexual assault before execution, usually by guards or by other prisoners, forced to endure violation as part of their punishment. The men would beg to be simply killed instead, would plead for any other form of execution, but Caligula would refuse, insisting that they endure this humiliation first. Even more disturbing are the accounts of what Caligula called mock marriages, forcing condemned men to marry each other or to marry animals before being executed. The prisoner would be dressed in women's clothing and forced through a parody of a Roman marriage ceremony, married to another condemned man or to a beast, while Caligula and his guests watched and laughed. Then the prisoner would be subjected to sexual violence by their spouse, human or animal, before finally being killed. The psychological torture of these mock marriages was profound. The prisoner had to endure not just physical violation, but the public mockery of one of Rome's most sacred institutions, marriage, being twisted into a form of torture. They had to endure being dressed as women and treated as women, which for Roman men was the ultimate degradation. They had to endure the laughter and mockery of witnesses who found their suffering entertaining. And they had to know that this story would follow their name forever, that they would be remembered not for their lives or accomplishments, but for this humiliating death. Noble women accused of disloyalty, or whose husbands or fathers were accused, faced similar but differently targeted humiliation. Cassius Dio records that Caligula would sometimes order noble women paraded naked before the imperial court, forced to stand on display while courtiers stared and commented on their bodies. stripping away every shred of dignity and modesty that Roman culture prized in aristocratic women. These naked parades might happen during official court proceedings, the woman standing naked in front of dozens or hundreds of witnesses while her family's accusations were read out, her body exposed as a symbol of her family's dishonor. Or they might happen during parties, the woman brought out like entertainment, forced to stand or walk among the guests while maintaining a neutral expression, any sign of shame or distress resulting in beatings or worse treatment. Some women were subjected to what the sources call public deflowering, forced sexual initiation in front of witnesses. Young noble women who had been carefully raised to maintain their virginity until marriage, whose virginity was supposed to be a source of family honor and a valuable asset in marriage negotiations, would be violated publicly and deliberately as punishment for their family's supposed crimes. The violation would happen in front of the girl's family when possible, forcing parents and siblings to watch, ensuring that the shame would be complete and that everyone involved would be broken by the experience. These practices were so horrifying that they shocked even Romans who were accustomed to the brutality of their society. Rome was not a gentle place. Slavery was universal, including sexual slavery. Women had limited rights. Violence was common. But there were still boundaries, still things that were considered beyond the pale, and Caligula systematically crossed all of those boundaries. The use of sexual violence as torture served multiple purposes in Caligula's system. It humiliated victims more completely than physical torture alone could. It generated intense shame that followed victims and their families forever. It created stories that spread rapidly. People might not talk openly about executions, but sexual scandals spread like wildfire, and the stories of what happened in Caligula's palace became notorious throughout Rome, and it demonstrated that the emperor recognized no boundaries, no limits, no areas of life that were sacred or protected from his power. Now, let me tell you about some of the most creative and symbolically loaded torture methods that Caligula invented or adapted, because his cruelty went beyond standard Roman punishments to include methods specifically designed for shock value and theatrical impact. One of the methods most frequently mentioned by ancient historians is what they call membertium, the Latin term for dismemberment, but referring specifically to a process of cutting off body parts one by one over an extended period. This was not the quick dismemberment that might happen in some executions, where a person would be beheaded or have limbs removed quickly to cause rapid death. This was slow, methodical, designed to maximize suffering and to keep the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. The process would typically begin with the extremities. Guards would hold the prisoner down. First, individual fingers would be cut off, one at a time, starting with the smallest finger and working toward the thumb, then the toes, following the same pattern. The prisoner would be conscious throughout, screaming, begging for mercy or for death, while Caligula would watch and sometimes provide commentary on their reactions. After the fingers and toes came the hands, severed at the wrists, then the feet, removed at the ankles. The torture would continue over hours, each amputation carefully calculated to cause maximum pain without killing the victim too quickly. Tourniquets might be applied to prevent too rapid blood loss. The wounds might be cauterized with hot irons to seal them and prevent the victim from bleeding out. The goal was to prolong the suffering, to give the victim time to fully experience each new mutilation, to understand what was happening to them, and to anticipate what would come next. The victim would be able to look down and see their body being progressively destroyed, their limbs removed piece by piece, their body diminishing before their eyes while the pain grew progressively worse. They would beg to be killed, would plead for any mercy, but Caligula would order the torture to continue, watching with what witnesses described as a kind of clinical interest, as if studying the victim's reactions to determine how much suffering a human being could endure. Finally, when the victim had lost all 4 limbs, when they had been reduced to a torso and head, they would be left to die from blood loss or shock, or sometimes killed by a direct blow to the head or chest. The entire process could take many hours. The suffering was beyond anything that most people could imagine enduring, and the stories of these deaths spread throughout Rome, making everyone terrified of what Caligula might do to them if they displeased him. Another method that Caligula used for particularly hated enemies was slow starvation with public viewing. The prisoner would be placed in a cell or cage in a public area, sometimes in the forum, sometimes in a courtyard of the palace where visitors would pass by, and left there to starve to death over a period of weeks. Water might be provided to prolong the process, but no food. The prisoner would be displayed daily, their progressive deterioration visible to anyone who passed by. Romans would watch as the prisoner grew thinner day by day, as their body consumed itself, as their ribs became visible and then prominent, as their face became skeletal, as they grew too weak to stand, and eventually too weak to even sit up. They would hear the prisoner's pleas for food, their desperate begging, and would see those pleas ignored. The prisoner would know exactly how they were dying, would experience every day of their slow death, would feel their body failing progressively, all while being watched by crowds who were simultaneously horrified and unable to look away. This method was particularly cruel because starvation is one of the slowest and most psychologically devastating ways to die. The hunger pains that begin almost immediately, the weakness that sets in after a few days, the metabolic changes as the body begins consuming its own tissue, the mental fog and confusion that develop, the profound misery of knowing that relief is just a few feet away, food exists, people are eating around you, but you are denied it, and will be denied it until you die. The process typically took 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks of progressively worsening suffering, while being publicly displayed as an example to others. Caligula also revived and modified an ancient punishment that had been largely abandoned, burying people alive. This punishment had occasionally been used in Rome's early history for particularly serious crimes, especially for Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity. But by Caligula's time, it was considered barbaric and was rarely, if ever, used. Caligula brought it back, applying it not just to Vestals, but to anyone he wanted to make an example of. The prisoner would be taken to a prepared pit or to an underground chamber. They would be placed inside, sometimes bound, sometimes free to move within the confined space. Then the opening would be sealed, either by filling in the pit with earth or by closing and locking the chamber door. The prisoner would be left in complete darkness, buried alive, to die slowly from suffocation or from thirst and starvation. The terror of this death is difficult to imagine. The victim would be conscious of being underground, of having tons of earth above them, or of being in a sealed chamber with no way out. They would feel the air growing stale as they consumed the oxygen in their small space. They would experience the progressive symptoms of asphyxiation, the headache, the dizziness, the difficulty breathing, the panic as they realized they were suffocating. Or if enough air was present to prevent immediate suffocation, they would experience days of being buried, alive, in darkness, alone, with no hope of rescue, slowly dying of thirst while trapped in a stone prison. Sometimes Caligula would have narrow breathing tubes installed in these burial chambers, allowing enough air to prevent quick suffocation, but ensuring the victim would live for days or even weeks before dying of thirst and starvation in their underground tomb. The victim would be able to call out through the tube, their voice carrying up to the surface where people passing by could hear their pleas for help, pleas that would be ignored on the emperor's orders. Perhaps most horrifying was Caligula's practice of forcing condemned prisoners to watch their own children tortured or executed before the prisoners themselves were killed. This combined physical torture of the children with psychological torture of the parents that was often more devastating than any physical pain could be. A prisoner accused of treason might be brought before Caligula for judgment. After the sentence of death was pronounced, the prisoner would be told that they would have to watch what happened to their family first. Children would be brought out, sometimes young children, sometimes teenagers, sometimes even adult sons and daughters, and then, in front of the prisoner, these children would be tortured. The torture methods varied. Sometimes the children would be beaten, sometimes burned, sometimes mutilated in the ways I've described. The specific method mattered less than the psychological impact on the prisoner who had to watch. Parents would beg Caligula to kill them instead, to spare their children, offering anything, everything, if only their children could be spared. Caligula would listen to these pleas with apparent interest, sometimes seeming to consider them, before ordering the torture to continue. The children would cry out for their parents to help them, to make the pain stop. Parents would try to break free from the guards holding them, struggling desperately and uselessly to reach their children. The psychological agony of being forced to watch your children suffer, of being unable to protect them, of having them call out to you for help that you cannot give. This torture of the mind was worse than any torture of the body could be. After the children died, the prisoner would typically be killed as well, but by that point they had already been destroyed psychologically. They had been forced to witness the worst thing that could happen to them, and death would come almost as a relief after that. These practices were recorded by Roman historians, not as isolated incidents, but as regular occurrences during Caligula's reign. Suetonius specifically notes that Caligula had people tortured and killed daily, that he would order executions just to pass the time when he was bored, that he seemed to require constant stimulation, and that torture provided that stimulation more effectively than any other entertainment. Now, let me tell you about the religious and philosophical dimensions of Caligula's cruelty, because he did not just torture people randomly or purely for sadistic pleasure. He believed, or claimed to believe, that he was a god, and he used torture as a way of demonstrating his divine power over life and death. Early in his reign, Caligula had begun claiming divinity. This was not completely unusual in Roman imperial culture. Emperors were sometimes deified after death, and in the eastern parts of the empire, where Hellenistic traditions prevailed, living rulers were sometimes worshipped as gods. But Caligula took this to an extreme that shocked Rome. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god, equal to Jupiter himself. He had statues of himself placed in temples throughout the empire. He ordered that sacrifices be made to him. He sometimes dressed as various gods, as Jupiter with a thunderbolt, as Neptune with a trident, as Apollo with a sun crown. And he used torture and execution as demonstrations of his godhood. He would declare, before having someone executed, "I can strike you dead as easily as I summon rain," positioning himself as a god who controlled life and death absolutely. The executions became, in his framing, acts of divine justice, the proper exercise of a god's power over mortals. Caligula would time executions to coincide with religious festivals, framing them as sacrifices offered to himself as a god. On feast days celebrating Jupiter or Apollo or other deities, Caligula would have prisoners executed in ritualized ways, declaring that their deaths were offerings made to honor his divine nature. The executions would happen in temples or in palace courtyards, set up like religious spaces, with all the paraphernalia of Roman religion, incense, priests, prayers, except that the prayers were directed to Caligula and the sacrifice was human. This religious framing of torture and execution added another layer of horror to what was happening. It wasn't just a cruel emperor indulging his sadistic desires. It was, in Caligula's presentation, the proper relationship between a god and his worshippers, absolute power, absolute submission, the god's right to demand anything including the lives and suffering of mortals who existed only to serve him. The Roman elite found this particularly disturbing because it violated their understanding of proper Roman religion. The traditional Roman gods were powerful, but not arbitrary. They could be propitiated through proper rituals and sacrifices. They followed certain rules, but Caligula, as a living god, followed no rules except his own whims. There was no way to propitiate him, no rituals that could guarantee safety, no understanding of what might please or anger him. Romans, who had grown up with a relatively predictable religious framework, suddenly faced a God who was completely unpredictable and who seemed to take pleasure in the suffering of his worshippers. The terror this created was profound. Romans began treating Caligula like an actual god, worshipping him desperately and sincerely, not out of genuine belief but out of absolute fear. They erected shrines to him in their homes. They made daily offerings. They prayed to him for protection, not because they believed he was really divine, but because the alternative, being accused of impiety, of failing to worship the emperor god properly, might result in being the next person tortured to death at a religious ceremony. Caligula himself seemed to sometimes believe his own divine claims, and at other times to be cynically manipulating religion for political purposes. Suetonius records conversations where Caligula would speak about other gods as if they were his colleagues or subordinates, discussing Jupiter's mistakes or Apollo's mediocre talents. Whether this represented genuine delusion or calculated performance is unclear, but the effect was the same: a reign of terror wrapped in religious language and justified as the proper exercise of divine power. Now, let me tell you about the sources for all of this information, because it's important to understand how we know about Caligula's torture methods and how reliable that information is. Modern historians have to be careful when evaluating ancient sources, and the sources for Caligula's reign present particular challenges. The two main sources are Suetonius and Cassius Dio. Suetonius wrote his biographical work, The 12 Caesars, in the early 2nd century AD, about 70 years after Caligula's death. He had access to imperial archives and to accounts written by people who had lived during Caligula's reign. Cassius Dio wrote his Roman history in the early 3rd century AD, about 170 years after Caligula's death, but he also had access to earlier sources that no longer survive. Both sources are hostile to Caligula. They were writing for audiences that viewed Caligula as a monster, and they had every incentive to portray him as negatively as possible. Some modern historians argue that the accounts of Caligula's cruelty were exaggerated by sources that wanted to justify his assassination and to make the emperors who came after him look better by comparison. However, several factors suggest that while some details may be exaggerated, the core of what Suetonius and Dio describe is probably accurate. First, their accounts corroborate each other on major points, even though they were drawing on different sources. Second, some of the torture methods they describe were standard Roman punishments that are confirmed by other evidence: dismemberment, exposure to wild beasts, crucifixion, and other brutal punishments were part of Roman judicial practice. Caligula's innovation was applying these punishments to Roman citizens and elites who were normally protected from them, and doing so with theatrical flair and in service of personal sadism, rather than as proper judicial procedures. Third, archaeology and legal documents confirm some aspects of the accounts. We know, for example, that mass executions did occur during Caligula's reign, because we have records of property confiscations from executed nobles. We know that Caligula did claim divinity because we have coins and inscriptions making those claims. We know that he was unpredictable and feared because we have letters from his contemporaries expressing that fear. So while specific details of individual torture sessions might be exaggerated or even invented, the overall picture painted by the sources of an emperor who used torture and execution as instruments of terror and entertainment, who targeted Rome's elite systematically, who claimed divine status and used religious language to justify his cruelty, that picture is probably substantially accurate. Now let me tell you about the final months of Caligula's reign, because the intensification of his cruelty eventually led to his downfall, killed by the very people he had terrorized into submission. By the beginning of the year 41 AD, Caligula had been emperor for less than 4 years. But those 4 years had seen Rome transformed from a place where at least some traditional protections and rights existed for citizens, especially elite citizens, into a place where anyone could be tortured or killed at any moment for any reason or no reason. Hundreds of people had been executed during Caligula's reign. Thousands more had been imprisoned, exiled, or had their property confiscated. Every senator, every noble family, every wealthy merchant had lost someone to Caligula's cruelty or knew someone who had. The terror was so pervasive that normal political and social life had become impossible. Senators were afraid to attend Senate meetings because they never knew if they would be arrested during the session. Families were afraid to show affection for each other in public because any relationship might be used against them. People were afraid to laugh at the wrong joke or fail to laugh at one of Caligula's jokes. They were afraid to worship gods other than Caligula too enthusiastically, and afraid to worship Caligula himself insufficiently. The entire city lived in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. Caligula's paranoia intensified during this final year. He began to suspect plots everywhere, to see conspiracies in every conversation, to interpret every glance and every expression as potential treason. And his response to this paranoia was, predictably, more torture and more executions. The rate of killings accelerated. People were executed for increasingly trivial reasons, or for no stated reason at all. The spectacles of cruelty became more frequent and more elaborate, as if Caligula was trying to outdo himself, to create ever more horrifying deaths. He began to suspect even his own guards, the Praetorians who were supposed to protect him. He would make comments suggesting that he thought they might be plotting against him. He would test their loyalty in cruel ways, ordering them to participate in executions, and watching to see if they hesitated or showed any reluctance. He began sleeping in different rooms each night, never following a predictable pattern, trying to make himself difficult to assassinate. But his suspicion of the Praetorians was not paranoia. They were, in fact, plotting against him. A group of Praetorian officers, led by Cassius Caria and Cornelius Sabinus, had decided that Caligula had to die, that his reign of terror could not be allowed to continue, that the risk of attempting assassination was worth it because the alternative, allowing him to continue as emperor, was unacceptable. The conspirators had personal reasons for wanting Caligula dead. Cassius Caria had been repeatedly humiliated by the emperor, who mocked him for having a supposedly effeminate voice and who would make him kiss his hand in degrading ways. Other conspirators had seen family members or friends killed by Caligula, but they also believed they were acting for Rome, to save the state from a tyrant who was destroying everything that made Rome worth living in. On January 24, 41 AD, Caligula was attending theatrical performances at the Palatine Games, a festival being held in the palace complex. The performances went on for hours. Caligula sat through them, watching plays and acrobatic performances, seemingly in a good mood. Around midday, he got up to leave the theater, perhaps to eat or to change his clothes before the afternoon performances. He was walking through a narrow underground passageway beneath the palace when the conspirators struck. Cassius Caria came up behind him and struck him with a sword, cutting into his shoulder. Caligula turned and tried to defend himself, but other conspirators rushed forward, stabbing him repeatedly. Within seconds, the emperor was down, bleeding from dozens of wounds. Caligula tried to call for his guards, but the conspirators had positioned themselves to prevent guards from reaching him quickly. He tried to crawl away, but they followed, continuing to stab him. According to the sources, he tried to speak, perhaps to command them to stop, but the words would not come. He died there in the passageway, cut down by men he had trusted to protect him, his blood soaking into the floor of his own palace. The conspirators also killed Caligula's wife Caesonia and their infant daughter Julia Drusilla, dashing the baby's head against a wall to ensure that no heir could claim the throne and continue Caligula's line. It was a brutal end to a brutal reign. When news of Caligula's death spread through Rome, the initial reaction was disbelief. Many people could not believe that the emperor was really dead, that the terror was really over. They had lived in fear for so long that they could not quite process that the source of that fear had been removed. Then came relief, and then celebration. People poured into the streets, dancing and singing, tearing down Caligula's statues, defacing his images. The Senate met in emergency session and declared Caligula's memory damned, ordering that his name be erased from public monuments and that his acts be annulled. But the celebration was premature. Caligula was dead, but the Praetorian Guard still existed and still had the power to make and unmake emperors. They chose Caligula's uncle Claudius as the next emperor, dragging him out of hiding where he had been cowering in fear after Caligula's assassination. And while Claudius was a better emperor than Caligula, almost anyone would have been, the fundamental problem remained. The emperor had absolute power, and that power could still be abused by a cruel or mad ruler. Caligula's death did not solve the structural problems of the Roman imperial system. Now, finally, let me return to where we began. To Livia Orestella, in that dining hall, standing before Caligula, her husband Piso chained and beaten in the corner. I promised you at the beginning that I would tell you what happened to her, what Caligula forced her to do over those 6 hours, how he used her suffering as entertainment for his guests. The details that the historians record are almost unbearable to read. Caligula did not simply rape Livia, though that was part of what happened. What he did was more calculated, more designed to maximize humiliation for both Livia and her husband. He forced Livia to recline next to him on his couch, to pretend to be his willing companion, to smile and laugh at his jokes, to feed him grapes and pour his wine, to act as if she were his honored guest rather than his prisoner. And all the while, her husband Piso watched from his chains, forced to see his wife playing the role of Caligula's companion, forced to watch her smile and laugh even as tears ran down her face, forced to see her trying desperately to comply with Caligula's demands, in hopes that it would lead to mercy for him. The performance went on for hours. Caligula would periodically turn to Piso and ask if he was enjoying the feast, if he approved of how well his wife was entertaining the emperor, making cruel jokes about Livia's behavior, while she sat there trying to maintain the false smile that Caligula had ordered her to wear. Other guests at the feast watched in horrified fascination, afraid to show too much sympathy, but also unable to fully hide their disgust at what they were witnessing. Finally, after perhaps 6 hours of this psychological torture, Caligula announced that he was bored with the entertainment. He had Livia taken away by guards. She was given to the Praetorian soldiers to be used as they wished, gang-raped by multiple men in the palace barracks, violated repeatedly over the course of the night, her screams audible from the dining hall where Caligula continued his feast. The next morning, as promised, Piso was executed. But the execution was not quick or clean, as Caligula had suggested it might be. Instead, Piso was dismembered alive using the membertim method I described earlier, his body taken apart piece by piece over the course of hours, while he screamed and begged for death. Whether Livia was forced to watch this is not clear from the sources. Some accounts suggest she was brought to witness it. Others suggest she was kept in the barracks being violated by more soldiers while her husband died. Livia herself survived for several more days, kept as a plaything for the guards, before she was finally killed, the exact method not specified in the sources, though given what we know of Caligula's practices, it was probably not quick or merciful. Her body was dumped outside the city walls without ceremony or proper burial. The story of what happened to Livia and Piso spread throughout Rome within days. It became one of the most notorious examples of Caligula's cruelty, whispered about in homes and discussed in shocked tones in the Senate. It was exactly the effect Caligula wanted, a story so horrifying that everyone who heard it would understand exactly what resisting or displeasing the emperor would cost them and their families. This is what tyranny looks like in practice. This is what happens when one person has absolute power over others, with no limits and no accountability. This is what Caligula created in Rome during his 4-year reign, a system where torture was entertainment, where humiliation was policy, where systematic cruelty was used as an instrument of political control, where the worst things you can imagine happening to a human being happened regularly and deliberately as demonstrations of power. The story of Caligula's torture methods is not just ancient history. It's a case study in how power corrupts, how sadism can be systematized, how entire societies can be terrorized into submission, how the human capacity for cruelty is nearly limitless when all restraints are removed. It's a reminder that civilization is fragile, that the protections and rights we think are secure can be stripped away by a ruler who recognizes no limits, that the worst atrocities are not random acts by individual monsters, but calculated policies implemented systematically by people who understand exactly what they're doing. What do you think about this history? How should we remember Caligula? As a madman or as someone who used torture as a deliberate instrument of political control? Can both be true? What lessons should we take from studying this period? Leave your comments below. If you believe this history needs to be told, that understanding how systematic torture has been used throughout history as a tool of political control is important, then subscribe to this channel and share this video. Hit that subscribe button right now. The ruins of ancient Rome still stand. Tourists visit the Forum and the Palatine Hill every day, walking through the same spaces where Livia Orestella was dragged to her fate, where senators were tortured in front of their peers, where thousands of people died during Caligula's brief reign of terror. The stones remember what happened there, even if the tour guides don't mention the details. Remember Livia Orestella, forced to smile through her own torture before being given to soldiers and eventually killed. Remember Senator Lepidus, forced to watch his children tortured to death before his own execution. Remember the countless others whose names we don't know, who died in Caligula's dining hall or his private chambers or his palace courtyards, their suffering used as entertainment and as examples to terrorize a population into submission. They were people, they suffered, they existed, and they deserve to be remembered not as abstract statistics in the history of a mad emperor's reign, but as human beings whose lives were destroyed by systematic cruelty, as victims of a system that used torture and humiliation as instruments of power, as warnings about what happens when absolute power meets human cruelty with no restraints. See you in the next video.